Thank you, Steve. I think I've known John and Maggie for about 20 years. I first met them when they were working with the Answer Coalition, which is one of the organizations I have admired the most in during my years of activism. They were very busy and very active and very dedicated to stopping the war in Iraq. And the Answer Coalition, to my mind, was one of the essential organizations that helped us in Los Angeles to mobilize in very large numbers to oppose the coming war against Iraq. And I well remember John and Maggie working to help us to prepare for our rallies against the war. And at that time, their son Sekou was perhaps 4 months older than our twins, Harry and Daisy. So now they're all about 24 or 23 years old. And I ran into John and Maggie recently at the Roger Waters "This Is Not a Drill" concert downtown. And I wonder if anyone else among the 16 participants today was in attendance at that concert besides John Parker and I. Okay, you missed something. And I would say that your dedication to the religion of rock and roll is somewhat lacking. You should have been there. It was a great concert. So I saw John and Maggie there, and I learned that John had made a fact-finding solidarity journey recently, and I wanted him to discuss that journey with us because I felt that it was one of the most important actions that anyone I know of has taken to address the conflict that is raging right now in Russia and Ukraine. So, John, I may have left something out in my introduction. I hope you'll amend it and take it away. I'm looking forward to hearing from you.
Well, thanks. It's really an honor to be able to speak here. Let me set my timer. Otherwise, who knows what will happen. But yeah, I'm member of the Socialist Unity Party. I'm the coordinator of the Harriet Tubman Center for Social Justice and a member of the Black Alliance for Peace. I guess I'm supposed to say a little bit about how I came about in politics and things. And well, you know, I started at 13 years old. A neighbor of mine got me into working with the United Farm Workers. So we were doing the boycotts at the stores and all those kinds of things. Then I participated in union work from organizing when I was a teenager. I was organized when I was a teenager with union election with the IUE, we used to be the International Union of Electrical Workers at a steel processing plant in New Jersey. And then later on organized a union election with the typographical union. It's no longer around, but the International Typographical Union, when I was a typesetter, when they used to have that in the 80s. But I really first got turned on to politics after receiving a beating at the age of 13 from white youth who were around 18 and older, who almost ran me over with their car while I was on my bicycle riding from a library in Red Bank, New Jersey. And this was at night. And after cornering me, they told me they were driving around looking for inwards like me. And I was fortunately able to escape from them and got found a home, knocked on the door, and fortunately a elderly white woman who was just happened to have attended the Methodist church my family belonged to, opened the door and helped call the police for me. I don't remember why we didn't, or if we did call my parents and they weren't home or something like that. It's kind of cloudy. But anyway, when she called the police, that's when I also learned that the police were not my protectors, since they refused to escort me home. I had another 3 miles to get home, even though these youth were still possibly in the area riding around. Well, I made it home, but then I took politics and racism a lot more serious, and realizing that my experience was not unique. And which is also why I take this issue of Ukraine and the rise of fascism very seriously as well. Well, folks may not know, speaking of Ukraine and the issue, the area, recently, there was the grain coming out of Ukraine because of the war. Of course, it wasn't getting out, and this really was detrimental to the developing countries, poorer countries. And there was a deal that was worked out with Russia and Turkey to allow the grain to continue flowing from Ukraine, and they could still sell their grain in spite of the war. Recently, there was a military operation by the Ukrainian military that kind of sabotaged that agreement. It's being repaired again, and hopefully the grain's going to continue. But there was a statement made by Russia that whether or not this agreement starts again, they would use their own stockpiles to give grain to African countries for free. Now that kind of goes against the narrative of the evil Russian Empire and the crazy bloodthirsty Putin. But why haven't we heard about this? It's kind of an important development and it really goes to the fact that we're only getting one narrative on the story about this U.S. war. We call it a proxy war against Russia. There's two sides to every story, and possibly both sides have some truth, but we're only getting one side of the story. And it really goes to the fact that newspapers, journalists and all, they say they're objective and all that, but that's really, there really is no such thing as objectivity, especially in a capitalist country. You're either on the side of the ruling class or you're on the side of the working class, and your narrative is going to reflect that. The facts that you choose are going to reflect that. It doesn't mean you have to lie, but the facts that you choose are going to be relevant to one interest or another. And the facts that I relay, I won't lie and say I'm objective. I'm not objective. I'm subjective towards the working class, and the facts that I relay are going to be true. In fact, usually the working class facts are usually more truer than the facts of the ruling class. They seem to produce a lot of misinformation. But the facts that I present are going to be true, but they're going to be relevant to the working class. For example, Queen Elizabeth, the late Queen Elizabeth, she had a nice smile, which is true, and it's a fact. It was a nice smile, but that's not the kind of information that I'd relay because it's not really relevant to the working class struggle. What's more relevant would be that the Queen Elizabeth participated in the genocide and colonialism against the African continent. That would be more. And if the workers in the UK knew that a little bit more of that, maybe they wouldn't have been willing to spend $6 billion on the funeral. Maybe they would have used that money to help with the inflation and the rising fuel costs and other things. Speaking of $6 billion, you remember when Jeff Bezos went up in that rocket and back down to the upper atmosphere, and he spent $6 billion or more for that little space trip. And he said something very honest. He said, well, I was able to do this because the Amazon because of my workers and the Amazon workers. And he was honest, he said, that's right. They created that wealth to be able to do that, to produce that wealth. They were the ones who created it. But the contradiction is they didn't have any say-so how that wealth is spent. If they had some say-so, they probably would have, especially the parents, Amazon workers, would probably have had used the money for the factories for infant baby formula. Remember, there was a big shortage of infant baby formula, but there was no shortage for money for the Ukraine. And back in September, Anthony Blinken went over to Kiev and he gave another $2.8 billion, which brought it up by September to $16.5 billion that went to Ukraine. And that's greater than the GDP, the gross domestic product of 98 countries combined. And this has basically been the greatest single transfer of arms to any country in the history of the United States. And it's really just the tip of the iceberg, because it didn't start in February. It started before 2004, when the United States was sending its NGOs, like the National Endowment for Democracy and USAID and others, to do what they call regime change. And they foment an atmosphere that creates kind of a civil war with billions and billions of dollars they use for media and other propaganda and other things. And after it gets hot enough, that's when they decide to employ the military, the violent aspect. And they used Blackwater, who were training private mercenary organization. Everybody knows Blackwater. They're the ones who were shooting at Black people when they were trying to escape the floods in New Orleans. That's the caliber of the folks that the US was working with, and training folks and arming folks with billions of dollars. In fact, it was about up to, before the beginning of this year, is about another $22 billion. And they trained folks to be the shock troops. And in 2014 in Ukraine, they had a democratically elected government, but the coup that was inspired by this US money and support and things overturned that democratic government. And they had another regime that was pro-US. Then they were able to get rid of the opposition, the socialists and the communists and other opposition, and then hold elections. But by then it was $22 billion just up to last year. But up to now, when you add the 16.5, 22 billion and the other money that's been promised, it's $70 billion that's going to Ukraine. And why is it going there? Well, one of the major reasons is to help with the expansion of NATO. NATO was expanded eastward to surround first the Soviet Union, now Russia. And NATO is probably the most belligerent, aggressive, violent military organization that the world has ever seen. When Martin Luther King said the greatest purveyor of violence, my own government, he was definitely talking about NATO. NATO has surrounded Russia. And when Ukraine decided that it was going to be a NATO country after this coup, and also be willing to take nuclear weapons, well, that kind of created an existential threat for Russia right on its borders. And as NATO was expanding all along, all this time for the last 20 years, actually it's doubled in the last 20 years, the Soviet Union and then Russia was complaining and saying, you're going too far, you're jeopardizing our sovereignty. But the provocations continued. Well, just think about China. As if China had gone and created a regime change and paid for it with billions of dollars and weapons and training in Canada, and put an anti-US government in Canada, and then had that government, had the military, have the weapons be controlled by ISIS. What would the United States do? Now, the reason I say the weapons controlled by ISIS in the analogy is because And these organizations that the U.S. supported, propped up, trained, they became the Azov Battalion, IDAR, Zvobota, SBU, Right Sector. These are all openly Nazi organizations, and they wear the Nazi symbols, from the SS to the Sonoran to the other things. They're proud of it. And they became official sections of the Ukrainian military. So especially in the Donbass region, which is in the east of the Ukraine, the Russian-speaking population is about over 6 million people there. That's where they lead all of the military operations, the Azov Battalion especially, and Right Sector. And so that Donbass region has been under assault for the last 8 years, and about 14,000 people were killed in the 8 years of that assault and the massacres and things. Now, people will say that, well, you know, the Nazi problem isn't a real, it's not a real thing. It's just some propaganda from Russia. Well, let's put it like this. Let's say Biden decided tomorrow to put up some statues all over the country in the United States, all over prominent areas. He puts the collaborators of Hitler, and he puts these statues up all over. Now, that's a turn. And then what if he decided to take some buildings and put them, give them to Nazi organizations, Proud Boys, gives it to the KKK, but specifically Nazi organizations. He just loans them, lets them have them for free for the purpose of indoctrinating youth. Okay, and then he's got the statues, the buildings, so that's another turn towards fascism. What then put the icing on the cake, takes every police department, closes them down, and sets them up again. I mean, we call for abolishing the police and having the community control, but he abolishes them first, but then he puts in place Nazi organizations in every police department and security outfit. Now, that's not exaggerating one iota about what's going on in Ukraine today. Not exaggerating at all. That's exactly what is going on in Ukraine today. So you tell me whether that's a turn towards, that's a problem with Nazism. Folks will say, well, they're only 2% of the parliament. Well, perhaps that's true, but you know, they're also putting mayors and governors, assigning them, and other military officials that are Nazis, openly Nazis, that has to be taken into account as well. So it is a problem. And in fact, when I first went to Lugansk, I went there in May. I was in Russia from May 1st to I can't remember, to the 5th or something. And then after that, I was in Lugansk. Lugansk is in the Donbass region that I talked about. In the north of the Donbass region is Lugansk People's Republic, and the south is a Donetsk People's Republic. Now, after the 2014 coup, they decided to become independent because they didn't want to be a part of this backsliding of history into Nazism. And they're being told that they couldn't speak their language. Yes, they actually passed laws in Ukraine that said the Russian language was illegal to be spoken in schools and stores and other places. So they decided to have an election. 89% of the people in the Lugansk People's Republic said that they wanted to be independent of Ukraine, and in the south, in the Donetsk People's Republic, about 82% said that they wanted to be independent in these elections. So obviously, overwhelming majority wanted they felt like they had a democratic right to do that, but instead of honoring their democratic rights, honoring with their vote, the Ukrainian military from 2014 on went into the Donbass region with tanks. And you can see these tanks littered when you go to Lugansk. You can see them littered on these highways that, and they were specifically there to attack the civilian population in 2014 and 2015. There were some ceasefire agreements and things that happened, but that's what happened in the beginning. Now, this assault by that happened for 8 years, and it led up to these provocations up until February. The US kept provoking, and the Russia said, stop it, you're going over a line, and they kept it up. It wasn't working. So in February 15th, by February 15th, there was about 70 bombings per day in the Donbass region. And by the 22nd, they decided to up it 20-fold. And then it became 1,700 bombings of the Donbass region per day. So that wasn't enough of a provocation. And then the Ukrainian military amassed 150,000 soldiers on the border of the Donbass region, ready to go in and finish off the massacre and genocide that they had been doing for 8 years. And that's when the Lugansk People's Republic and the Donetsk People's Republic just formally asked for the participation of Russia to come in and protect them and protect the lives of their children. So Russia did that. And our position is the Russian, not only did Russia have a right under Article 51 of the United Nations to protect its sovereignty from an existential threat, they also had the right and responsibility to stop a humanitarian massacre and genocide that was about to take place. Nobody doubts that was going to happen. Now, there's been this recent referendum that they're saying is a Russian land grab. Well, I'll talk more about when I went to Lugansk. Oh, I did. I'm sorry, I'm skipping things. I drink more coffee. When I first got into Lugansk, the issue of the Nazification of the area was brought up by religious leaders. I was part of a panel from leaders from Belarus, Russia, Ukraine, of top Muslim, Christian, Jewish religious leaders. And the main topic was how to stop the Nazi ideology that was growing so quickly in Ukraine. So a lot of folks thought that people over there think that it's a very big problem as well. Now on this referendum, which goes to the case of why did these people in Donetsk People's Republic and Zaporozhye and Kherson, why did they want to be part of the Russian Federation? Well, once you realize what they had been going through, and some of the stories, which I'll show a video of that as well, of the people, of the experience that they had with the Nazi-led military in the region, and the things that they did, and the torture and the massacres and things that you never hear about on this side in the United States or in the Western media. You ask yourself, why didn't they do it sooner? I mean, well, in the first place, this referendum had about 1,000 international observers from 100 different countries, and greater than 96% of the people voted to become part of the Russian Federation. Now, the US media is saying it's still just a land grab. Let's just take 4 days, why they did it. Let's take 4 days in September in the Donetsk region, from the assaults from the Ukrainian military. Yeah, see, on the 19th of September, there was a apartment building was bombed by the tanks by the Ukrainian military. On the 20th, a school was bombed. Many people were killed, about 9, I think it was. And on the 21st, a hospital was bombed. On the 22nd, they bombed a minibus, not a minibus that had military folks in it, but a minibus it was just a public transportation just folks riding the bus. And they used a 155 millimeter shell to bomb this minibus. Now, when I went into to Krymskaya of the Lugansk region, there was a hospital that was taken over by the Ukrainian military. They retrofitted for their war, and they kicked out the tuberculosis patients and things. And they used that. And when we inspected it after they'd been pushed out, I was able to go in and look at all the shells. And most of the shells that they use are 122 millimeter shells. And they're used for going through tanks, going through aircraft. So imagine this was a 155 millimeter shell that went into this minibus. So that's the kinds of things that they were experiencing on a daily basis. And that might explain why they wanted to join the Russian Federation. And you ask yourself, well, why don't we hear about these things at all? Well, one of the main reasons is that there's two media that are allowed to exist in Ukraine. And one is the Euromaidan Press, and the other is the Kiev Independent. Both of these media outlets were created with money from NATO and NGOs, and along with the staff who have been supported by these same the forces, from the European National Endowment for Democracy to the National Endowment for Democracy here in this country, and other organizations that are basically from the US intelligence. So these organizations like the Azov, like the Kiev Independent, has a very close relationship with the Azov Battalion. The Azov Battalion feeds them the videos and the information, and this is passed on to them. And that information is passed on to the New York Times and Washington Post and CNN with no verification, similar to what the non-verification that they did during the Iraq War. The New York Times actually apologized for that and said, "Oh, yeah, sorry, we didn't verify the information from the Pentagon. Meanwhile, 500,000 children died." So that's where the information is coming from. And if there are any journalists or media outlets that are saying anything counter to the US narrative, they're either jailed or killed. And many of the folks that we spoke with who were actually one of the translators of the trip, that when I went there had to escape from Odessa because he was on a list to be killed. And he had been in the parliament in Ukraine. He was a socialist. There's many stories out there. There's the stories about from Lyudmila Denisova, who was the ombudsman of Ukraine. And she said that 25 teenagers were raped by Russian soldiers, and 9 of them are pregnant now. And the story with the names and the details and things, when they were investigated, it was obvious that this was not true at all. In fact, the parliament in Ukraine fired Lyudmila Denisova, fired her, and said they fired her because she was not using facts and she was embarrassing the parliament. And they produce a lot of misinformation, actually, but they don't want it to be so blatant that it embarrasses them. So she was fired for that. But the Euromaidan Press publication, another one of the major publications that the US media and Western media get their information from, they continue to publish the story to this day. And to this day, the Western press continues to use that story to push these narratives. Now, we don't know what's true and what isn't true, but we do know that the US lies whenever there is and the corporate media becomes a tool of the Pentagon when they're trying to push an imperialist war. We learned this from 1915, from the Lusitania, the sinking of the Lusitania, and how the New York Times helped promote to get the U.S. into World War I to the year. I'm sorry, my dog is it gets emotional about this. The 1964, the New York Times, or the paper of record, right? The New York Times published an article about the Gulf of Tonkin incident, where they just out and out lied about an attack from the Vietnamese on PT boats. But the day that article went out was the day that Congress decided to give Johnson war powers to prosecute the Vietnam War, which killed 2 million people in North and South Vietnam. And many other instances, but we all know about, the babies that were thrown out of the incubators stories, and the weapons of mass destruction, the chemical weapon factories and things that were in Iraq, and that was all a lie. And meanwhile, like I said, 500,000 children died from the lie. So whatever stories that are coming out, we don't know whether it's true. And that's why we had to take the trip over to Lugansk and to try to get the information that's not coming to the people here. Now, there was another story in your maiden press about Rubizny, and I went to Rubizny and in the Lugansk People's Republic. And this story was talking about an account from a woman who was talking about her parents who were in Rubizny, and during the fighting, and this was about 3 or 4 weeks before I went there into this village in Rubizny. And she said when the Russians were controlling the area, and the Ukrainian military had put people up in a shelter to protect them from the Russians killing them. And it was hard to get any food or water to these shelters. So her parents were bravely going in and trying to get water to this shelter. That's all they were trying to do. And they were shot at a Russian checkpoint, and the mother was killed, and the father was, in his last dying breath, he called her up, and he talked to her until he died. This is a heart-wrenching story about these atrocities. But a lot of that, there's truth. But there are two things that were not true, the two little details. One is that in the time that they were talking about this story in Rubizny, the Russians were not in control of Rubizny at that time. It was the Ukrainian military that was in control. And when I went to the shelter in Rubizny, there's a shelter full of about 350 people that had been there to that shelter, and they left their apartment buildings in the area because they were being bombed from Ukrainian tanks, not Russian tanks. Ukrainian tanks. And in fact, because the area was controlled by the Ukrainian military, it was hard for those shelters to get any kind of aid or anything like that. There was no fuel, so they couldn't pump from the wells to get water. They would have died, starved to death, died of thirst, if it weren't for the fact that the Russian military, in spite of the fact that it was still under control of the Ukrainian military, they went in and were able to give them supplies. Now, that's what they told me at the shelter in Rubizny, and when we were there. So now I'm gonna play a little video real quick, just on that incident. Now, the person who's, I'm gonna share my screen first. Let's see. Right here. It's this one, yeah. Share. Okay, I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully the sound works. Oops, you know what? I got to do something to make the sound work. 1 second. I have to do share sound. Optimize for video clip. Okay, I think now it will work. Okay, so here, let's send this out. Now, we went to this shelter in Rubizny and talked to the person who was in charge of it, and the translator is Alexei Alba. Albu, who was the person from parliament in Odessa. And he's the one who had to escape to Lugansk. Okay, let me just start this.
We need to solve this some logistic problem.
When did this area pass under the Russian control?
Он спрашивает, а когда эта зона вот перешла именно вот под контроль ЛНР России?
Да, ну это
Maybe a week and a half.
ну,
Okay.
плюс-минус там как бы, ну, мы ж не считали.
So the helps are very recent, what I'm saying. It's 1 week that they're receiving help from the Russian side.
То есть
Before there
получается,
was
вот
nothing.
вы, вот он спрашивает, вы помощь от России получаете вот на протяжении недели?
Нет, нет,
Давно?
мы уже очень давно, как только началось, нам как начало как бы.
When the part of this city was under control of Ukrainians, but Russian forces helped them. So they, it was very dangerous, and all these roads were very dangerous.
Заходи,
It's
заходи.
danger now, but it was danger more danger. They closed, Russian soldiers closed eyes on this danger and bring some help for civilian people who needs it, needs this help.
Очень редко как бы. Ну, за это я говорю, потому что я была здесь, я хотела уехать, не было ни гуманитарки, у меня ребенку 3 года.
So she said that the Ukrainian side did not help at all, and she feel ache and she began to cry because she remember the situation with her child.
Which is this girl there? It's her.
And the dogs were very frightened, and people were very frightened, and they ran out from these burning houses and shouted, "What are you doing? We are Ukrainians."
Но это не помогло. Сами солдаты приходили, улыбнулись и отворачивались от горячего.
When people began to run out on the streets and shout, "Don't do this! We are Ukrainians," the soldiers just laughed, and she wanted to understand who exactly shot it in her house, and she came to Ukrainian soldier and began to speak with him in Ukrainian, but her native language is Russian language.
Но это не помогло. Через минут
When she asked, why are you doing and why are you shoot this to the neighbors' houses? Nobody answered her, but maybe 20 minutes passed, and one more Ukrainian tank came and began to shoot directly in her house.
Okay. Okay. So was everybody able to hear that? Yeah. Oh, good.
Yes.
Okay. Sometimes it doesn't work. So, you know, this wasn't the first time. I've been on a lot of trips, anti-war trips, fact-finding trips with former U.S. Attorney General Ramsey Clark and to Sudan and Iraq and Syria and other places and things, Iran. And one of the things that really it's hard to convey with words is the misery that folks, you can see it in their eyes. There was an 82-year-old woman there at the shelter that she was just crying because all she had left was the pillow and the blankets on her bed, and everything was gone, and there was nothing she could do about it, and she couldn't defend herself. She had to be at that shelter, and it just reminded me of when I was in Iraq in the 90s, and with Ramsey, and we were investigating the sanctions and the effect of the sanctions on the children and how it was killing so many children and how it really was an act of war. They couldn't get things like asthma inhalers. So people were dying of asthma attacks. They couldn't get chlorine to clean the water after the US had bombed the infrastructure. And so the hospitals couldn't get clean water. People were dying of dysentery. And they were also dying of cancer and leukemia. The leukemia rate went up about 300% in Iraq because the US was using depleted uranium bombs, which aerated after they hit their targets. And I saw this child who was dying of leukemia, painful, in the hospital. And a painful death. You can see the pain in the child's face. But, what was more painful, I think, who were going through more pain were the parents watching this child. They couldn't do anything about their child who was dying and suffering. Just like the woman I talked about, the 82-year-old woman, just like that, and just like the folks in Iraq, they were dying from US weapons that were being given to them. In fact, when I was there, when we were doing the interviews in that shelter in Rubizny, there was a bombing, another attack by the Ukrainian military on another apartment. Luckily, it was abandoned, the apartment, but it was very close to where we were. And I'm thinking to myself, wow, my tax dollars went to that shell that just bombed that thing that could have killed me. I got to remember to thank Joe Biden for that. The bombs that hit, what Martin Luther King said, the bombs that explode, go to Vietnam, explode in the US in poverty, it makes that direct connection. And there really is a direct connection to what's going on to Ukraine and what's going on to the United States. In this tour of the report backs that I'm doing, we also went to Buffalo, New York. And that's where the top supermarket was attacked by this white supremacist 18-year-old who killed 10 Black people in the supermarket there. He did it, and he said he did it in his manifesto because he was inspired by this person from New Zealand who has in direct communication with the Azov Battalion. See, the Azov Battalion has a social media aspect, and they rose greatly on Facebook. And actually, I was able to, in about 3 or 4 clicks, get to their recruiting video on Facebook, since they're no longer the bad guys. In 2019, they were the bad guys. The Nazis were a big problem. The FBI talked about it. But after this February, they weren't the bad guys anymore. So they have a social media presence, and they encourage folks to do these types of things that happened in the top supermarket and put them on video. Now, the person in the Buffalo who did that was wearing the Sonoran, which is a symbol, a Nazi symbol. It's a pagan symbol, but mostly it was adopted by the Nazis in World War II, and it's one of their main symbols. It's a symbol of the Azov Battalion. Now, the person in New Zealand, who this person said he was inspired by, he killed 51 Muslims in a mosque, and he was also wearing the Sonoran, the Black Sun symbol. And he also said that he was in direct communication with the Azov Battalion, and he was going to go there for military training. In fact, Newsweek reported that the FBI had said that 17,000 people have gone through Ukraine to get military training. White supremacists go to the Ukraine, get military training, 17,000, and then come back and use it against their own home countries. So it's a big problem, but the FBI refuses to put them on the terrorist list. And some of the folks, the Congress people who had that letter saying that they want negotiations and then they took it back. They want negotiations with Russia instead of escalation of war, and then they took the letter back because of pressure. Some of those same people had said that they wanted the Azov Battalion to be put on the terrorist list in 2019, I think it was. So they refused. The FBI hasn't done that, but the FBI did go after the African People's Socialist Party because they said they were being assisted by Russia in some way or something like that. So these witch hunts are beginning again in this country, and the censorship is like nothing we've ever seen before. But we can't rely, we know we can't rely on the FBI, we can't rely on the Democratic Party to do anything about this. But if we remain silent, we're going to see some more things like we saw the Birmingham churches burning, because white supremacy is getting a shot in the arm from this policy, from the billions of dollars that are being funneled into Ukraine and into these forces. So why are we spending this money? $70 billion. Okay, I'm 41 minutes. All right, I'm going to end up right here. Why are we spending this $70 billion when there are hurricanes from climate change that are creating havoc? When people are dying, drowning in prices and inflation, and gas prices are almost $7 a gallon because of this war. When we're still fighting different strains of COVID, and there's still not enough healthcare, and all of the crises, the infrastructure is falling apart, and they're spending all of this money for this and not for what's needed here. We have so many problems in the United States that have to be dealt with. And one of the main things is that we're being pushed closer and closer to World War III. Now the United States has said that they are putting boots on the ground. The active duty personnel, military troops that were consigned to Kiev are no longer consigned to Kiev. Now they can go where they want to go, to whatever places. The United States is not saying where they're going, but now the US troops are actively going throughout Ukraine, which means they can become targets, which means escalation of war could be right around the corner. People will say, well, the US wouldn't do anything that reckless to create World War III. They wouldn't do. Just think about what they did in Hiroshima. The 80,000 civilians were killed instantly by the bombings in Hiroshima by the United States. And then once they saw what they did, and then 140,000 later died. But once they saw what they did, they didn't say, oh my God, we did this, we should never do this again. They did it again in Nagasaki. So the US is capable of doing anything when it comes to oil profits or their own interests. But we have the power to stop them. And, I always talk about the immigrant rights demonstrations that happened here in Los Angeles, of 1 million people in the streets, and it happened twice, once on March 25th and once on May 1st. March 25th, it was on a weekend, and it had an impact. But on May 1st, it had a huge impact because 1 million people came out, but they did it on a Monday, on a weekday. They withheld their labor, and the corporations lost billions of dollars. And the reason they did it was to stop this racist bill called the Sensenbrenner bill, which was a racist bill against the immigrant community, basically making it a federal crime for helping them or the things that they were doing. So they didn't lobby, they didn't wait for the vote, they just withheld their labor power. And you know what? That bill disappeared just like that. It had passed the House, it was about to pass the Senate, but it wasn't able to, it just disappeared because the corporation said, no, this is too much. We can't be losing billions of dollars in one day. So that shows the power, the potential power that we have when we come together, and we can stop these wars by uniting and being in solidarity with the international working class. That's 45 minutes, and I'm going to stop right there.
Thank you, John. Our style is to have people raise their hands to ask questions or make comments. Folks can use the reactions button at the bottom of Zoom to raise your hand the way Dave just did. You can also, I'll try to watch the screen for people who physically raise their hands. And at some point, if anyone is on the telephone and doesn't have access to this kind of technology, then at an appropriate time, speak up and we will call on you. I've got 4 hands, so I'll go right through them. Dave Clennon. You're on mute, Dave. Dave, your lips are moving, but we can't hear you.
I apologize. I would like to retain my time, but I would like to yield to the other 3 or 4 people who have their hands raised. If you would come back to me after they have a chance to ask their questions.
Sure. Remind me if I lose track of that. Dick Bunce.
Well, anybody who goes overseas and digs in and sees this country from an entirely different perspective, as I did back in the 60s in Iran, and heard their experience of US British imperialism, which took out a democratically elected leader and replaced him with Peacock Throne, which was totally tyrannical. Comes back to this country just absolutely frustrated with the ignorance that characterizes the American society. I want to ask you, John, if you have a blog, if you operate a blog, and how we get on that in the event that you do.
Oh, thanks. Well, I'm a writer for this newspaper, Struggle La Lucha. It's called Struggle La Lucha for Socialism, but it's strugglelalucha.org. Struggle is the newspaper, and the accounts that I have, there's a lot more, but they've been in the Black Agenda Report and Covert Action Magazine. If you just put my name in there, you can see that. But
And how do you spell Alucia?
La Lucha, I'm sorry. Struggle La Lucha, LALUCHA. Like La Lucha Continuum.
Okay,
StruggleLaLucha.org.
very good. Thank you very much.
Thanks for asking, because I should have plugged that.
Thank you. Carol Francis.
John, that was fantastic. Thank you. I'm curious as to whether you know anything about the effect, not only the more recent current bombings of the Donbass, but also the fact that the Nazis were invading the Soviet Union in World War II and the Soviet people, which, you know, did that include Ukrainians? Are there people now that remember the fact that the Soviet Union saved them from being taken over by the Nazis? Is that play anything into the consciousness of the people of Russia and Ukraine?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. You know, when I first went in May 1st, like I said, I was in Russia, and I went to some of the May 1st celebrations. I was surprised that there were so many red flags and hammer and sickles and all that kind of stuff, because I know Russia's capitalist now, but there is still you know, the Russian the Communist Party of the Russian Federation is the second largest party in parliament. There's still other communist parties there that participate, and so May 1st was full of red flags, and you can go into the stores and see the hammer and sickles and other places. So that's still alive and well, and and on Victory Day, which was May 9th. Victory Day is a day that they celebrate the defeat of the Nazis. And everybody was in preparation and celebrating on that day in Russia and in Lugansk, except not in Ukraine, because in Kiev, it was illegal to celebrate the Victory Day. Kind of surprising that it was illegal, but many of the people are talking about, they're frustrated. They said in the Donbass region that they said, we fought these Nazis. We've gone through this already. Why are we doing this again? And they're very frustrated because everybody has a parent or a grandparent who either died or whatever, or participated in World War II, and which is, you know, I'm kind of surprised how people don't understand why the Russian people and the people in the Donbass region are so upset about this. I mean, they lost 27 million people during the during the war. If it wasn't for the Soviet Union, the Nazis probably would have won. It wasn't John Wayne, it was the Russian soldiers, the Soviet soldiers, I should say, not the Russian soldiers. So yeah, that sentiment is there, and people are very frustrated about that. And it's a totally different history of the Russian military than it is with the U.S. military. I remember having this conversation with one of the Lugansk militia soldiers and also a Russian soldier there, and he was asking me about the differences between the Russian soldiers and the U.S. soldiers and things, and you can tell because they don't have the history of the My Lai massacres and the other types of massacres that the U.S. soldiers have participated in, from Iraq to Afghanistan to other places, because the U.S. soldiers are trained to they have to train them to basically do things that a psychopath would do, and that takes training. That takes a lot of work to mold folks into being able to go into a village and kill. That same experience isn't the Russian soldiers, and the Lugansk people soldiers don't have that same experience. So I don't know why it's so easy for people to think that the Cold War is real again. And the left, we used to laugh at all the stereotypes about that they say about Russia and other things. And now it seems like it's all being adopted and it's all being believed so easily right now. But anyway, yeah, it's a long-winded answer.
Steve, you want to call on Fernando?
Yes, I'm sorry. Fernando.
Well, first of all, I really thank you, John, for your presentation. It's really very informative, But it seems to me that we have tremendous problem here in the U.S. We have the homelessness. The infrastructure is really crumbling, and the money. You're right. We spend tremendous amount of resources in Ukraine, and yet they cannot take care the people here in the United States. And it seems we have a blackout in a sense. The corporate media is really running the show, CNN and so forth. I guess my question is that how can we effectively really expose this imperialist greed that's happening, not just here in the United States, but all over the world, because I'm really afraid. This is like what they did it to us. I'm a Vietnam era veteran, and they hid, they used the so-called democracy, and at the same time, we're doing a crime all over the world, including here in the United States among the blacks and so forth. But let me just put it right there, and maybe you can answer some of them. Thank you.
Yeah, the problems domestically the problems of police brutality are still very real, and Biden's answer is, fund the police more. Well, yeah, I think we're on a record of how many Black and brown people are being killed by the police this year since the Washington Post started taking the measurements in 2015. So those problems, like you said, the homelessness, the inflation, all of these are exacerbating, and the rent controls that the rent during the pandemic, they were not allowing the landlords to evict all of the folks. Now those safeguards are being taken away. We can just imagine how much of a crisis we're going to have with homelessness and things. But it doesn't seem to be the trajectory, the inertia that the U.S. has towards spending more money on war and not on peace and on domestically is continuing. And as we see them go into Taiwan and create the same kind of provocations against Russia, they're now doing it against China. In fact, the National Defense Strategy report just came out. And it looks like, it really looks like a declaration of war against China and Russia. It's really shocking. Folks should get it. It's a National Defense Strategy Report. I think I'm saying it the right way. And then you look at the fact that now the US is trying to send troops into Haiti. It's just like a war on the world, and a war, and this with sanctions and other things that are going on, and which is why we really have to build the unity here in this country, and in Europe. But you're also not seeing the demonstrations that are going on in Europe and Czechoslovakia, former Czechoslovakia, in Italy and Western Europe and in the UK. Tens of thousands of people are demonstrating in the streets to mainly because of the inflation and the fuel prices, which is going to get a lot worse this winter, but also because they are upset that their money is going towards this war, which is exacerbating their crises. And there are folks saying, let's get out of NATO. I think there was a huge demonstration of 100,000 or so saying, let's get out of NATO in Europe. But we're not seeing this reaction. So the suffering that we're seeing at the gas tank here, or the suffering is also going over there. So it presents an opportunity to link up the social issues, the domestic issues, and the want that we have here and they have over there, and link up this international struggle against imperialist war. And that's where people are going to, people are first going to respond if we talk about the needs and why aren't these needs being met, and why are we spending all of this money for something that's doing nothing but killing. Yeah, so I think that's our opportunity, and I'm glad that the ICUJP is having these demonstrations on Guantanamo, because some folks are thinking that, you know, it's just demonstrate on the internet and that's it, but you got to get out there, because people have to see what the media is not telling them, and the only way they're going to see it is if we get out there in the streets and do things. So I'm really glad ICUJP is doing that.
Thank you, John. Phil Way.
Yeah, thank you, John. My brain's on information overload right now. It was a terrific presentation. A couple of things. One, you mentioned in one of your responses about U.S. military being trained to do atrocious things, psychopathic things. And it struck me that may have a whole lot to do with the prevalence of PTSD among American servicemen, American vets. And it's something that nobody's talking about. In general, I think the federal government is totally not talking about PTSD among vets, from my perspective, because there's a culpability there. War is atrocious anyway, but if they're trained to do atrocious things, it could really add another layer. The other thing I initially raised my hand about, I can recollect my thought here. Hang on a second. It was clear, it's becoming clearer to me that the U.S. culpability and involvement in the history of this conflict is appearing greater and greater in my perspective. And what I was thinking is that now it's real clear to me why America is not initiating a peace process, because they've got too much. U.S. has too much on the line in terms of the NATO bases and U.S. bases and along the Russian-Ukraine border. I think, in fact, Ukraine is fighting our war, and in some very important ways. Could you comment on that?
Yeah. I have a cousin went into Vietnam, and then after he came back, he wouldn't talk. He'd stay in his room, and he wouldn't socialize. He wouldn't talk, and it's definitely PTSD. I know another person they wake up screaming at night. They can sleep 3 hours a day. That's all they can do. Also in Vietnam. And so, I just can't imagine all the suffering that the veterans are going through, because they have to remember the things that they were forced to do. That's one aspect. If they got back alive, or if they with all of their limbs and all of that, one place. So you're right. War is just horrible. It's horrible. I mean, undoubtedly, civilians are being killed on both sides. Undoubtedly, that's the nature of war. Like I think Che said, it takes your humanity away. But we have to show where the provocation is coming from. What's the motor force of these wars? And like I mentioned, the National Defense Strategy report that just came out, it talks about China, especially more than Russia, which is surprising, but it talks about them as competitors. And it almost uses as a justification, they're economic competitors, and that this competition is hurting U.S. interests, and that's kind of the justification for increasing war threats against them. And it talks about climate change as if not in the terms of what we can do how we can stop it, but how to use the effects of climate change in war. It just turns our priorities upside down. So these kinds of things it's very important, and it's definitely important for people to understand that that this is not just a war against China and Russia, but this is a war to stop the forces that are assisting the continent of Africa and Latin America, especially we're talking about Bolivia, Nicaragua, Venezuela, Cuba. What would happen if China and Russia were no longer a buffer in between US imperialism and these countries in the developing world? China is the reason I'm not so surprised that they talk about China in the National Defense Strategy thing more than Russia, is because China is a huge threat to the IMF and the World Bank because of the Silk Road projects, the projects where they're giving loans. They're actually giving some things for free to Latin America and Africa and African countries. They're forgiving the debts, and the loan arrangements are allowing these countries to build up their infrastructure for once, and they own that infrastructure. And that's one of the main ways they underdeveloped Europe, underdeveloped Africa, as Walter Rodney said, not allowing them to have their own infrastructure. Well, those Silk Road projects that are allowing that to happen, and they're also allowing these countries to not have a dependence on the World Bank and the IMF. This is costing a lot of profits from these banks, these financial monopolies, and that's a serious threat to U.S. capitalism and Western capitalism. So that's why they don't want peace, like you're saying. That's it.
Thank you. Dave, would you like to go now? Anthony has also raised his hand after you.
Okay, Steve, I definitely want to hear from Anthony, but I will take a shot right now. First of all, I want to repeat for the benefit of everyone in the group that John's report on his journey to Lugansk has been published in 3 parts, again, on the Black Agenda report, the Black Agenda report. It's also been published, at least part of it has been published in the monthly review, which many people will be familiar with. And I want to pose a quick question before I go on. the question is who, this is for everyone, who is the most prominent advocate for, Anthony, you're unmuted. Thank you. Who is the most prominent advocate for negotiations on the American political scene? And I'll say many people know the answer, I'm sure, but I'll save it. I would like to underline something that is very clear from John's presentation. If you read the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, if you watch CNN and MSNBC, if you read magazines like the New Yorker and the Atlantic, if you listen to radio programs on NPR, you think you know what is happening in Ukraine. And I ask you to question whether that is really true. And I would like to say a quick word about Democracy Now! I've been very disappointed in Democracy Now! Sometimes they tell the truth, but maybe not the whole truth, and maybe not nothing but the truth. I've been disappointed in Democracy Now! Because they have given platforms to pro-war people like Professor Timothy Snyder from Yale University. So I don't think that we can trust the corporate mainstream media. Unfortunately, we have to go to obscure, marginal websites to get honest accounts of what is going on in Ukraine. And frequently those accounts come from retired military officers who are different from the retired military officers who are paid to spread propaganda on MSNBC and CNN. So you have to maybe adjust your thinking a little bit and look at websites that you might normally avoid or you might not even hear of in order to get something like the truth. I'll let it go there. The answer to my question, who's the most prominent advocate for negotiations on the American political scene? My answer is Donald Trump. And I refer you to an article on the Black Agenda report by Ajamu Baraka. That name probably rings a bell. He was the vice presidential candidate for the Green Party. And Ajamu Baraka posted on October 12th, posted an article entitled, "Trump Calls for Peace in Ukraine While Democrats Make Support for War a Midterm Campaign Issue." And on that note, I want to thank John for this eye-opening report. I've spoken with John, but I heard things today that that I had not absorbed before, and I want to repeat again that John's article is also available, as he told Dick Bunce, is also available on struggleLaLucha.org. And I'm grateful that John is thinking about making another journey to Ukraine, and I wonder if he wants to talk about that maybe in the context of his socialist contacts there and the Socialist Unity Party here in the United States? What are the connections that enabled him to find his way to Lugansk, halfway around the world? Thanks,
John,
Ken.
a few comments on that before I go to Anthony.
Okay, yeah, just well, we've been working since 2014, especially Melinda Butterfield has been working especially with the folks from Borotba, which is a socialist organization. They were actually trying to get become a political party in the parliament around 2014, but they weren't able to do it because of the coup. And instead of being members of the parliament, they had to flee. So these are the forces that are in Lugansk and Donetsk who are helping get folks over there to see what's going on. And like the translator, Alexei Albu, was one of them, Barutba. So yeah, we're hoping to try to get back over there again and get more of this information out, especially now that they're being accused of the people of Donbass and Kherson and Zaporozhye are not being listened to again. And that's how the justifications for this war really occur, when they keep the voices of the Donbass people silent, when you're not able to hear their reflections and things. So that's why we need to go back there and present more of that to the U.S. But just real quickly though, on the Trump stuff too, Ajamu was writing too, just mainly to say how far the Democrats have fallen to the right, that even somebody like Trump, who is no friend of folks, because Trump, a clock is right, 2 times a day or something like that, a broken clock. But the fact is that Trump is still a white supremacist. He's still someone who, if you align yourself with him and his forces, it's not a way of being in solidarity with the Black community, at least. So it was just kind of a recognition of saying that how far the Democrats have fallen. Even the Squad, they all voted for the war. And it just shows that, you can say progressive things domestically, like Amy Goodman, you can say certain things, but there's a certain line you can't cross, and that is to defy imperialist war if you want your career to keep going. So that's it. Thank
you, John. A little bit of business. We've got about 10 more minutes before our closing. We so rarely get Dick Bunce here. Dick, could you collect your thoughts for a closing prayer to send us off at the end of the meeting? I read that as sure, if I'm lip reading. Thank you. Anthony, did you take your hand down, or you want to say something? You're on mute as well.
Hi there. I did want to just say how grateful I am to John for providing this perspective. I think it's been clear to me, and I think to all of us, that this kind of black and white presentation by American media that, the Ukrainians are the heroes and the Russians are the villains is utterly false. And that it's much more complex than that. My own perspective is that war is evil, and not that one side is evil and the other side good, as often the media portrays it. And you've also persuaded me even more that pouring endless weapons into this region is not going to provide a solution. It reminds me of what happened in Syria. It'll just simply lead to a prolonged war with. So I could go on, but I think because time is limited, I want to get to the question, which is, from your perspective, and I think your perspective is to try to look at it from a working class socialist view. What would you see as a positive outcome to this tragic war if hopefully, bringing people to the negotiating table? What would you like to see as an outcome that would be beneficial to the working class people of the Ukraine.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting that when people voted for Zelensky, I mean, and that's still, we don't consider that a democratic electoral process, since they'd already gotten rid of all the opposition, all the socialists and communists, which would have been their main opposition. They got rid of them, and then they had what was left. Okay, so but people did vote for Zelensky because he said he was going to patch up things between Russia and Ukraine. They didn't want an escalation, and that's what they voted for, and that's what they didn't get. So it's clear that everybody in Ukraine would like there to be peace, of course. And right now, the way the Ukrainian military is operating, they're just sending tons and tons of troops as cannon fodder to hit up against the Russians, and that's taking huge amounts of losses. So there's going to be a lot of body bags in Ukraine for the families and things. And, you know, I mean, Ukraine their economy was fantastic before the collapse of the Soviet Union as well. But I think they want to see, they want to see what we want to see, and into the things that are taking away from the basic social needs that we need to have, from the prices to the homes, affordable homes, to affordable health care, all of these things that are being denied, education, all these things that are being denied to us right now. We would like to see that returned. The only way that's going to get returned is if we stop this $1 trillion military budget of the United States and stop NATO from encroaching on the rights of on the sovereignty of other countries and the money that's being spent for this most belligerent military alliance. So the best thing to happen would be for an end to NATO. I mean, the Warsaw Pact ended. Why can't NATO end? And for this war to stop, and for these provocations of the U.S. to stop. And then we'll see a better world, I think, and a world more like Elmo that I see that you have in your thing there. I notice Elmo's red too. I wonder why.
Thank you. I raised my own hand, and I'll call on myself, and then I'll call on Sophia. You may know, John, our motto is that religious communities must stop blessing war and violence. And I think and I'm so grateful for your perspective today, what many of us are grappling with is, when does provocation justify military intervention? And can you speak to the question, if accepting the history and the analysis you've provided regarding NATO and the US foreign policy, when does that justify a military incursion across the border of Russia into Ukraine, and then the use of overwhelming military support?
Yeah. Oops, am I unmuted? Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. And it's partly answered by when you take away the censorship that's been going on, like I said, in the Donbass region. Because as long as if Donbass is out of the equation, then it looks like this wasn't justified for the Russians to come in and go into a sovereign country and things like that for the provocations. Although, there is that existential threat of Nazis controlling your military, and you're willing to take nuclear weapons that are actually 5 minutes away from Moscow. So there is that. But when you put in the equation the Donbass region, it makes it even clearer, because if you ask yourself, if the Soviet intervention did not occur, would there have been a massacre of the Donbass, of the people of the Donbass region? And if you look at the facts, you have to admit, you have to say that these folks would have been 150,000 troops on the border. They had already increased the bombings 20-fold. And these people were under some severe torture. Because like I said about how you teach psychopaths, the people, I had another video, but we don't have time to show it. But there are women who were talking about when they were occupied in Krymsky, they were occupied by the Ukrainian military, and they were talking about how everybody in the military wasn't Nazis, but the folks who were leading them, their commanders, were Nazis. And what they would do is they'd humiliate the soldiers, and they do these kinds of things, make them do horrible things in order to make them, psychopaths, in order to make them Nazis. So these people had gone through this for 8 years, this torture of children, anyone. And so 8 years, so they knew that this massacre was about to occur. So you ask yourself, should you allow a massacre to occur of people? Did they have the right to ask for that help? And if the Soviet intervention did not happen, that massacre would have occurred. Did they have a responsibility to protect those people? So if you put the question that way, it's a different kind of thing. It's not just about a provocation. It's about protecting, stopping a genocidal nightmare.
I want to mention that Carol Francis has put a link to John's article. It's in the chat. It's a few chats above where we are right now in the chat. So be sure to copy that and save it so you can go directly to John's article. Our last question will come from Sophia.
Yes, I was glad to hear your presentation. I had seen your videos in the past, your coverage. And when you talk about Donbass and you talk about NATO, whether it would be a massacre or not, yes, there would have been a massacre because it's a military operation and they wanted to, isolate Russia. My concern is that when I've talked to people and try and talk about the fascism and the Nazi involvement, and then the historical analysis of, how the Soviet Union helped win the war and had the highest number of casualties, there's this resistance and people trying to say it's propaganda because there's not enough coverage of the fascist Nazis on the ground in the Ukraine. I'm hoping in the future you could cover that a little bit more because there is this misinformation. And so just thank you for your work and your courage for being on the front lines.
Oh, thank you.
A few closing remarks, John, and then we'll finish up.
No, just
May I ask you this way?
Oh, go ahead.
We always try to think, and I think that's where Anthony's question was headed. Are there allies in the public sphere? Do you find anyone either in political life or public life that you feel is communicating this kind of information to the public?
Oh yeah, definitely. There's Graham Phillips, I think, from the UK. He does a lot of reporting on Ukraine, a lot on the western part of Ukraine. That's Eva Bartlett as well. She exposed the white hats in Syria, and she's doing a lot of reporting there. And there are many others now. I think I was actually the first person from the US to get to the Donbass region. But since then, there's been a lot of other information out there. And there's folks and there's international organizations there's an anti-imperialist international coalition that is getting information out. Sometimes you got to use a VPN because I notice when I search for things on the browsers and things, only when I use a VPN and say I'm from another country, then I can get to access to other information. But also not to be afraid to use the information of the so-called enemy. They tell us that you can't, if you're going to believe Reuters and CNN, then you might as well also look at TASS. You might as well also look at the Cuban news and see what they're saying about this, the other stuff. So it's there's information out there. It's hard to get, but we can use social media sometimes to do it. But I will say that the Facebook and Twitter and TikTok are now controlled. The censorship is being controlled by groups like the Atlantic Council of NATO, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, which gets money from the United States government, and they are officially controlling what gets censored and what gets put on from Facebook to TikTok to Twitter. Yeah, so it's hard to get the information out, but that's why we have to, talk to folks, get out in the streets, and speak truth to power.
Thank you, John, very much. And thanks for your personal courage in going into these areas of war. You're like a war correspondent for us, and we are grateful. And if you're going back, please be as safe as you can and come back to us again. This is our time, after so much information, to calm ourselves, to join in a virtual circle, to bring within our circle comments and lifting up of family, friends, colleagues, and others who need a good word at this time. So the floor is open for that. I want to lift up a person named Norman Beal, an activist with the ACLU, and only this morning I learned that he passed away. Was a tragic loss for a real bright, compassionate individual.
Yeah, I want to uplift the people here in the United States to really wake up, because this nuclear bomb is not a joke, and so Russia would not do that. But clearly, the United States is about to really trigger the nuclear bomb, and so it forces the Russian to retaliate and so forth. But we should really spend the money here at home, because our veterans and our people here is really suffering, and hopefully we can do that as well. And I'm willing to engage in many anti-nuclear movement here in the United States. Thank you.
Thank you. Vida?
Yes, I'd like to lift up Rick Benalis. This morning he's taking care of his parents. It's a hard time for him, and he does such great work for ICUJP.
Well said. Phil?
Yeah, okay. The discussion about PTSD and the atrocities of war just brought me back some memories of my former brother-in-law, Arthur Gillibrand. He is one of the many people who was suffering from PTSD before it was really recognized or diagnosed. He's uncounted PTSD vet. He was a helicopter evacuation pilot in Vietnam. He was transporting dead and injured people out of war zones. I learned that somehow, but he has never spoken of it, never. And he became kind of a recluse, but he attached himself to my family and lived with us for 15 years. It was just something that was so clear that he was damaged by that experience, but it was never spoken.
Thank you, Phil. Sophia, I want to be sure your hand was up before when you made a comment. Are you?
Yes, just and just on that note, just lifting up all those like Odelia and Vera who are are hurting because they're standing up to the racism right now in City Hall, and to all the vets that are going to be dealing with issues for Veterans Day on the 11th, and their families and everything they're going through. It's going to be a rough week for them before the 11th comes, so that we hold them up. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's turn to Dick Bunce to close us off.
Okay. Well, let us together virtually join hands and hearts, form a spiritual circle of love, and come before the God of many names, petitioning in behalf of the personal concerns just expressed, and also grateful for John Parker and the John Parkers of the world, who feel the call and live out the call to find truth and to share it. And let us bring before the God of many names our hopes for sanity that has moral depth. Let us bring before God our fears. People of goodwill are scattered, demoralized, feeling impotent in the face of such vast forces. Let us pray for and be leadership. And let us find a new voice for the songs and the chants of peace. And let us march together, unmoved while moving. We shall not be moved. We shall persist in the cause of peace and justice and love. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much, Dick. Thank you, John. Thanks, everyone else. Dave, thank you
Thanks,
for
everybody.
being our
Thank
Zoom
you, John.
host. See you next week and every Friday at 7:30. Thank you, everyone. Be safe.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you.